got announced, usually there was only a very short time and it would have to be announced again by the time they would get through all the languages. That was the last time I heard the announcement in all the languages that said, you are free to go on deck, which, excuse me, I'm just getting over laryngitis, which usually was locked until sunrise. This was at 4 o'clock in the morning. And the reason for the loudspeaker person announcing that we were free to go on deck was because now the Statue of Liberty was visible. How many of you have seen the Statue of Liberty in reality, not on pictures? Okay, and most likely you were on some kind of a vacation, some kind of a happy occasion to see the Statue of Liberty along with other things. Well, let me assure you, the sight of the Statue of Liberty for an immigrant from another country who cannot talk a word of English, who sees that for the first time after 9 days of being seasick, extremely seasick, is quite a different occasion. And here again, I would like to say that it was such a happy occasion to see the Statue of Liberty. After all, she says, give me the poor and the huddle of masses and all of that. But when you picture a person who has only heard pop propaganda from another country, we heard a lot of good things about America. That's why we wanted to immigrate. But we also heard a lot of bad things. And until you see it for yourself, you don't know the difference. You don't know what you're going to get into. But at any rate, shortly after that announcement, we arrived in the harbor, and I took my last walk off the boat and set on American soil at Ellis Island. We were the second to the last transport that ever came through Ellis Island. The first impression I got was, after all, this was this rich, wonderful country where milk and honey flows, and the walkway between the boat into the big auditorium in Ellis Island was made of wood, and it was so decrepit that we had to be careful where we stepped. The holes were so big, we didn't want to fall down into this dirty ocean. So that was our first impression. But after that, I'm going to say for the end of my narration here as to what happened after that. Before we got on this boat, I was an immigrant a refugee for all my life. I was born in 1935 in the Ukraine, which at that time belonged to Russia. That's the year when Germany went to war with Russia. So we were in the middle of the front lines of war way before that war ever turned into World War II. My ancestors were German. Well, we were still German, but my ancestors had immigrated from Germany and the Netherlands to the Ukraine under Catherine the Great when they were seeking asylum someplace because they were what is the word for not wanting to bear arms? They were pacifists, and so Germany wanted to get rid of them because they refused to serve in the army. They were all Mennonites. Anybody that is familiar with that religion will know why. And so they then built big German colonies. By the time I was born, I didn't even realize that I was in Russia because it was all German. The schools were German, and we spoke only German in our home. That was right after the Lenin Revolution, when most of the Germans in Russia were annihilated. My great-grandfather's two brothers were massacred along with the Tsar at the time. Their names and the description of the torture that took place before they actually killed them is listed in the American Library of Congress. I have a copy of the page number, which really surprised me because I only found that out recently, and I always assumed that the Library of Congress had information only about Americans, but it doesn't. There were my great-grandfather's names. By the time I was born then, we had to be German in secret. This is hard to do with small children when you speak only German in the home. I was strictly forbidden to ever open my mouth to say even one word once we left our house, because as soon as somebody would hear us talking German, it was instant banishment to Siberia of the father, usually the head of the house. So I was not allowed to speak when we left home. Unfortunately, my parents never explained the reason for it. It was just that I wasn't allowed to speak when I left home. And in a German Mennonite family, children do not ask why. You just obey. And when you're told not to talk, you don't talk. The war was very close because our little village, Korpica, was located right on the banks of the Dnieper River. And the whole war took place with the power going from one side of the river to the other, and we were right in the middle of that. So gunfire and bombs were nothing unusual. That's what I grew up with. When a child grows up with that from day one, it isn't a case of thinking that here is the war and here are the guns or anything. That's life, because that's all you know. You don't know that there are countries other than where you're at where it's different. And it continued to be the same when the German army entered Russia. For us it was liberation, because now we were under the rule of our own people, the Germans. Alas, we found out very quickly that the German government under Hitler was different than the German government had been in the 1600s when my ancestors left Germany to come to the Ukraine. Those were the stories that I heard from my grandmother telling me about the good life under the Tsar. For 3 years, we were under German occupancy, and it was a fairly good life if you consider daily bombings and people dying in front of your eyes normal. It was normal. At least I could speak outside the house. But nobody told me that now I could speak. And by that time, I had turned 6, and I was expected to go to school. My mother took me to the first day of first grade, introduced me to the teacher, and left me there. The teacher asked my name, and I did not answer her. And then the teacher asked where I lived and who my parents were, and I did not answer her. And my teacher asked a few more questions, and I did not answer her because I was told I was not allowed to talk outside my home. Of course, the teacher was not aware of this, and I was not aware that the rules had changed. So by the time the second day, my father came to pick me up. The teacher said that I was retarded and therefore barred from going to school, that they didn't have room for retards in the school. This was happy news for me, because I had to school anyway. Unfortunately, now I had time on my hands, and I had to play with the small children who were not of school age. And I'm telling this story usually when people ask me about what life was like, not because it's so extraordinarily unique, but because this was daily life for those years in Russia. I was playing with a girlfriend, and we kind of wandered away from home. There were no restrictions. We were out in the country. The daffodils were blooming. Incidentally, those of you that seen the movie Dr. Zhivago, all the daffodils, well, that was my backyard. It was filmed actually in the same region where I was born. And it was beautiful. The flowers were blooming, and we were picking flowers and doing what usually 4- and 6-year-old children do. We children were strictly informed and warned not to play with anything that we found that was other than just what nature handed out, like flowers, because being in the front lines, there was a lot of debris from blown up planes and all kinds of ammunition that could be very harmful. And like I said, I was very obedient. When my parents told me don't pick up anything that looked strange, I did not pick it up. But my girlfriend was more adventurous, And she crawled up the bush there and she says, God, would you look at this? Isn't that pretty? And she had kind of an egg-shaped thing in her hand, and I thought to myself, okay, that looks like something that the grown-ups are telling us not to play with. So I told her not to play with it, but she was not obedient like me. She says, no, this is pretty, I like this. So I decided that I better run home and get Papa to take care of this. As I turned around to run to get my father, I heard this explosion, and when I turned around, all I could see was pieces of her little dress floating down from the sky. And like I say, this was not unique. This was daily life. At one time, we were eating lunch outside. In the summer, it's hot in Russia. You get under the nearest shade tree. We had this big pot of borscht. Anybody that's familiar with Russian cuisine knows what that is. It's a thick cabbage soup that you have just about every day. And just as we were saying grace to start eating, there was shrapnel falling from gunfire bombs, I don't know which, and a human finger attached to a piece of a shrapnel came through the air and fell right in the middle of this pot of soup. And my mother very chalantly picked up the spoon, dug out the finger, flung it across her shoulder, and we ate the soup. This is what life was like. It was normal for pieces of human bodies to be flying around or to just be laying on the street, and for a child that grows up with that, it's nothing unusual. The war became heavier and heavier right on the front lines there for us as the Russians once again gained power. Somebody didn't make the announcement.
I turned it on, but I can't believe I turned it back off on.
That's right, same too.
But at any rate, as the war kept on growing closer and closer, every morning the German army that was at that time in our area sent out hundreds of very young soldiers to the edge of the river, and they would fight shooting across the river until one or the other would gain the upper hand. And by afternoon, the shooting would slow down. By evening, a handful of soldiers would come back to be replaced with a whole new shipment in the morning. So every day we lost hundreds of young soldiers, the Russians on one side, the Germans on the other. It was the job of us small children who were not old enough to do any actual work to walk around the dead soldiers by the edge of the river and take the dog tags off the bodies, and then the grown-ups would shove the bodies into the river because there were too many to be buried. Many times as I took the dog tags off of a soldier, he would reach up and not be dead yet and say help, which is a very confusing thing for a 6-year-old to have an adult ask for help and not knowing what to do or what help would be available. Again, that was daily life. Slowly the Russians took over and the Germans retreated, and at one point a military car with a foghorn, that was the only way they had to make announcements in those days, drove through the streets saying that anybody who wanted to leave Russia and immigrate to Germany as they were retreating, there was one train available only, and it was first come, first served. Once the train was full, it would pull out. We had no time to pack anything except to just grab what we could and made it as fast as we could to the train. It was total chaos at the train station with everybody trying to get in. By the time the train was ready to leave, the train only had, you can't even describe it as boxcars. They were just a platform with boards and somehow pieces of wood nailed together on top of it. There were 45 people in each of those boxcars. We were in there like sardines. We lived in that train for 12 days and nights, Once the train started pulling out, we realized that there was no way that we could relieve ourselves. There was no way to stop for anything. We just had that one little spot assigned to us to sit, usually on our coat as a blanket, and the train started moving. When nighttime arrived, we actually were happy that there were no windows in the train or anything, because the only way that we could relieve ourselves was there was one family that had a little bucket with some foodstuffs that they brought. We took that out and we passed the bucket around. By the time a few days were gone, the stench in that boxcar was enough to make all of us vomit, which also added to the stench. We were getting pretty fatigued by that time with what little food we had brought that we could eat. It never stopped. Nobody stopped to see if we needed anything until about fifth or sixth day, about halfway through. The gunfire that we heard over the train kind of slowed down. The train slowed down, the door opened, and the military personnel was walking by, and they said, there's a creek down at the bottom of the bank. You can go relieve yourselves, get some fresh water to drink. It's safe here. There's no more enemies that we have spotted. We all went out. It was October. It was a beautiful October day, nice and warm, and the sun was shining, the birds were singing. We all scrambled down to the river, and just as we were getting some fresh water to drink, gunfire broke out from what seemed just behind every bush and tree that was around there. Everybody scrambled for the train as fast as they could. The only way to get in and out of the train was pretty high up from the ground, was with little makeshift ladders that were leaning against the door. As soon as the train started moving, those ladders disappeared with the movement of the train, and the men just grabbed us children and threw us into any boxcar that happened to be still open. The women scrambled in as good as they could by themselves. The doors were locked. The shooting continued, and the train started moving. My father took a head count. We were lucky enough that my brother and me and my father all wound up in the same car that we left. Most of them did not. We heard the screams of the people that were left behind as the train pulled out. When we took the head count, my mother was missing. We hoped that she had gotten into one of the other boxcars. The train kept on moving. It was eerily quiet and dark, and after a while we heard somebody knocking on. There was a little opening. You can't call it a window. It was just a hole on the side with kind of shutters that could close. There was a knock on one of the shutters, and the grown-ups started talking about, do we dare open it? You know, I mean, the enemy, we're still in enemy territory. And I heard one voice say, well, the enemy isn't going to knock on the window, you know, so open it already. And so my father opened the window with the help of another man. There were two arms hanging down saying, pull me in, pull me in. Well, it turned out to be my mother. She had gotten on the last car of the train and crawled over the top of the roofs of the trains until she got to ours. The cars were all marked with big numbers on top and on both sides. And she remembered the number, and so that was a happy reunion. That was the trip into Germany. I'm going to have to cut this short. But
all the time you
once we got to Germany, we expected a real welcome from our German ancestors there. Everybody was going to say, oh, welcome home. Well, that did not happen. The born in Germany Germans looked at us as the Russian refugees, and they said, go home, Ruskies. So in Russia, we were persecuted and not wanted because we were German. Then we were in Germany, and we were persecuted and not wanted because we were supposed to be Russian. Even though we had a paper, which I still have, that has the swastika stamp on there that we are Germans, that didn't make any difference to our neighbors. And my life from then on, that was in 1943 until 45, existed in living on trains, in train stations, or just by the side of the road, and marching mile after mile after mile after mile. That's all we did. Was by that time the railroad was usually bombed out, and we just had to march from one place to another. The way Hitler moved us around out of enemy territory and into safe places which were never safe. Finally, in 1945, we heard on the radio that the war was over. Then was the aftermath of the war, which was not much better than the war itself. But we were lucky enough to be in the American zone, and we found out that the Americans were pretty nice people. The first thing they did in the schools came uniformed doctors and nurses to examine us children to see which ones of us were malnourished. Well, duh. We all had to strip down to our underwear, and we had to stand in line, boys and girls together, which we could not believe that the Americans would do to us, but they did. And so we stood in line, and the doctor would listen to our heart and other things and make some notations on paper, and then we were told what category we fell in, and I looked like one of those pictures you see nowadays of the children in India, you know, just skin and bones and great big eyes. And so I was in the worst ones of being malnourished. That's hard to believe now, but that was true. I was 9. And so every morning when school started, we had to line up for a nourishment break, those of us who were so malnourished. And that consisted of a cup of hot chocolate, which was heaven, and some kind of a roll and cod liver oil. We thought, sure, the Americans were trying to poison us. But, that was every morning. And then in the afternoon, we got a bar of some sort that was 3 colors, brown and white and pink. Well, now I know it's strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate. And that, the only thing written on it said 350 calories. I have no idea what a calorie was in those days. I do now. But that was instant addiction. That was the most wonderful stuff that anybody could eat. And we started gaining weight very rapidly. From then on, that's what I've battled. But immediately, after the war was over, and we were assigned certain apartments to live in rather than on the side of the road, and things became more or less normal, we were told that we could apply to immigrate to America. Well, we had no home in Germany, and we were not wanted in Germany besides, so of course we wanted to come to America. It might not be very good, but it couldn't be any worse than what it was. That was in 1945 in June. The war was over in May. And it took us until 1952 of filling out papers and being examined. The teeth were examined. If you had a cavity, you were immediately canceled out. If you had a spot on your lung, which all of us that were born in the Ukraine had at one time or another had tuberculosis, so we all had spots on the lungs. Then we had to go through treatment to finish that off first. And so it just went on from 1946 to 1952. We lived a temporary life, just waiting for the mailman, because there would be that all-important letter that said, come to Munich, to the camp, to immigrate to America. It didn't come, it didn't come. In the meantime, you know, life goes on, and I became a teenager and went into being an apprentice in a dressmaking shop and started to enjoy life in Germany. And just about the time that it was good, we got that letter. And it said that you need to be in Munich the next day at 3 o'clock to sign in to be processed to immigrate to America. Well, we sold what little furniture we had accumulated. We sold everything to have enough money for the ticket to get us to Munich. We lived at the time in Bavaria, but in Regensburg, which was still quite a ways. We hopped on that train and we went to Munich, and once more we got placed in a camp. We were so used to camps by that time. And every morning at breakfast, they put a new sheet of paper on the sign of the building that had the names of the people that were supposed to go to Bremerhaven to board the boat. And we thought that that would be just a few days maybe. Well, we were there for 4 months, every morning going to read our name on the paper. Our name did not exist. We finally gave up looking at the paper. It wasn't going to happen. We were just going to live a life forever in camps. And then my brother, who's 5 years older than me, came running into the room where we were housed, not by ourselves, big room with many people. And he said, "Monty, Aggie, look here, our name is on there. We need to be in Bremerhaven. The train leaves at whatever time." So once again, it was hurry up and wait. Like most of you have been in the service, you know how that goes. And so we wound up on the train to Bremerhaven. Well, before we went on this train, we had one afternoon to go into the town of Munich to spend what money we had left, because we came over on a government quota. You were not allowed to have more than, well, you were not allowed to have any money. At the boat site, they gave us each $20 to come to America with. So we each had 10 marks or 15 marks left, and my mother said, "Okay, let's go spend our money." Now, I was going on 16, and I had never had a doll, my heart's desire, and I spent my 15 marks on a doll. I couldn't afford a doll that was dressed up pretty. I figured I could make dresses for her. So I got a naked doll that was in the bag, and I refused to open the bag to show this naked doll to anybody. But by that time, when we boarded the boat, I walked on that boat carrying this doll in the paper bag. When we got to Bremerhaven, once again, we had to line up according to the alphabet of our last name. And there, before we boarded the boat, there was a table with officials that had paperwork, and a German official gave a little speech saying that we needed to know that once we boarded that boat and signed these papers to board the boat, that what these papers meant was that we were giving up German citizenship rights. And so that meant that we were without any citizenship, because in America we would not get American citizenship for 3 years if we proved ourselves worthy. If we got into any trouble with the law, America had the right to deport us immediately, no questions asked. Well, for us, getting in trouble with the law could mean neglecting to say Heil Hitler when a soldier walked by. So, you know, you could be in trouble with the law for anything, and if they deported us, Germany had the right not to accept us. So now we would be on the ocean going where? So again, it was a very scary time. But by that time, we had learned to live vicariously. We signed the papers. I didn't have to because I wasn't 16 yet. But my mother signed the papers, and we walked onto that boat. We started to be seasick, I think, 5 minutes after we got on the boat. This was an old army transport boat. We all slept, except for very old people like my grandmother and women with very small children. We all slept in this one huge room that was lined and had rows of bunk beds. The bunk beds were 5 high. You couldn't lift your head without bumping the bunk on top. And this was with all the people being seasick in there. And no air coming in. This was below the deck line. The regulation was that you couldn't come into the mess hall if you were seasick. I mean, visibly seasick. Which was fine, but you had to stand in the long, long line, and when you stood in the long, long line, the closer you got to the kitchen, the more you smelled the food and the more you got seasick, so we didn't eat. Finally, one of the boat's attendants, that was a very, very, very tall, colored soldier. I remember that because I had never seen a person that black before in my life. And he handed me a can of sour balls. And he says, they don't taste good, but they'll keep you from being sick. Well, they didn't keep me from being sick, and he was right, they didn't taste good. But it was a pleasant thing that he at least looked out for me. One day, my mother and I were hiding behind the little staircase that went up on the top where nobody was allowed to go. And in the evening, by about 5 o'clock, the loudspeaker announced that we had to all go below deck because the doors would be locked. Well, we were so seasick and so hungry, not even hungry anymore, just so malnourished by that time, we didn't pay any attention to the loudspeaker and didn't hear it. And somehow, when the guards went to see, they didn't see us behind that little staircase. And we were up on top deck the whole night. Well, the waves were just washing over the top of that boat. It was a real stormy time on the first week in March. And by morning, we looked like snowmen because the water that had washed over us left the salt deposit, and then the air current dried us, and so now we crackled as we walked with the salt falling off of us. And that was just a few days before we arrived in New York. In the meantime, the showers all malfunctioned the first day we were there. We did not change clothes in any way, get cleaned up for the whole 9 days that we were on the ocean. And this is how we arrived in New York. Now, when you remember seeing movies or the newsreels about these refugees coming in at Ellis Island, I am sure at least one of you must have said, why do they have to be so dirty? Well, that's why. That's what we look like. And now I will come to what I was going to say at the beginning. When we got off the boat and into the big auditorium in Ellis Island, as they opened the doors and we walked in, that whole huge auditorium was lined with little booths all along the perimeter by different charity organizations, the Red Cross being one of them. We recognize the Red Cross because of the big Red Cross. And they had different kinds of food that they gave out, which was wonderful. And I noticed that every one of them had some kind of a banner on top, by cloth or paper, homemade or printed, that said the same thing. In big, bold letters, it said, welcome. And I can hardly tell this without still resorting to tears, because that was the first time in my life, at almost 16 years old, that somebody welcomed me. Up until then, it was go home to wherever home was supposed to be. And here was this big country that said welcome. And they started giving us sandwiches and all kinds of different food, which really you couldn't eat too much. When you go without food for days, you can only take a few bites. But there was one booth that I don't remember what the charity was, didn't know. They had the right idea. Never mind about sandwiches and chips and who knows what. They had donuts and hot chocolate. Oh, love donuts. I took one and I ate that and I was transported in heaven. I mean, an addiction started right then. And immediately I started to plot my criminal behavior. And at the same time, I was just so worried that I would be deported before I even got off of Ellis Island. I decided that I needed another donut. That was all there was to it. And I was willing to steal or do anything I had to get another donut. So I decided to disguise myself. I put a babushka on my head and everything and stood in line again, hoping that they wouldn't recognize me. And I guess one of the ladies not only recognized me, but she knew what I was up to. And she came over with a tray of donuts and she said, honey. Now, in Germany, there's a woman's name, Hani, and I thought that's what she called me. And so I tried to tell her that my name was Agathe, and she had no idea what I was saying, but she got it across to me that I could take another donut. And I just looked at her, and she picked one up. She says, take one, you can have more. Well, I just shoved donuts down my sleeves and in my pocket. I mean, I was the donut girl. That was America. They welcomed you and they gave you donuts. So Needless to say, when we left there, we got put on the train, no more announcements in 9 languages. Now we were on our own, and we were supposed to go meet our sponsors in Cleveland, Ohio. So here we were on the train now. Before we got on the train, as we went through customs, through the line, they had to look through all your belongings. Well, we didn't have any belongings except one satchel type of a bag, but I had my paper bag with my doll. And so the official looked at that, and now I realized, piecing together a few words that I remembered, what they were saying is they figured that no 16-year-old girl is going to bring in a doll to another country. There must be contraband in there. So they dismembered my doll to look for contraband. Some people that came over on the quota, they did smuggle in diamonds that they had somehow gotten. I won't go into the story there, not have time. But anyway, so then they just put all the parts of my doll in a paper bag and gave it back to me. So that wasn't so nice. But while we were on the train going to Cleveland, Ohio, it occurred to me that this is what American life would be like. And this is how I would be treated by every American I ever saw. And I must say, in trying to get established in America, that was largely true. To this day, I marvel at us, which I am now one of you, Americans, for taking in bedraggled-looking immigrants like I was once and being kind to them, offering them jobs and help and whatever is needed. That was the general way that we were treated, except for the one person who decided that I was the perfect victim, the person who wanted to marry me. He was discharged from the Army as a diagnosed psychopath. And he figured that at 16, not being able to talk any English and not knowing any ways, I had probably never heard of such a thing, and so here was the perfect person he could torture. For 13 years, I lived in hell. That was my beginning of America. We had been in America only a few months when my mother decided any American boy that wanted to marry me would be a good thing, because then I could not be deported anymore. I would have American citizenship. And so, so I got married off very quickly. He did not talk a word of German, I did not talk a word of English. Now, is that insanity? That was insanity. But that's how life began. Somehow we produced 2 wonderful children, 2 girls that are the light of my life, but they were also a big encumbrance. When you're married to a psychopath, life is not what we know it as life. It's a totally different war. It's a psychological war. And I had to keep my children safe. But eventually, he finally wound up in jail, which was a happy day for me. But now I was left at, 22, 23, with 2 small children, no job skills, no education, and needing to support us. So life was very hard. I could not enjoy my children as much as I wanted to, because there was always that heavy burden of having to support them. I always held down 3 jobs, but somehow America offered the freedom that at least every time the threat of him coming out of jail and being after us came up, I was free to get into my old dilapidated car and drive to another state and get another job and try to continue life. During the war, we were not allowed to do that. We could not just find an apartment that was empty and then move in. That was a reason to be sent to the concentration camp. You had to be assigned where you lived. So at least I was in a free country where I could do that, and eventually got a divorce and freed myself completely, and the children grew up to where we were protected from whatever happened. But as the children then became teenagers and were on their own, the burden of having to do it all became too heavy, and I had a total nervous breakdown. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome and was assigned a psychiatrist on an outpatient basis to see. And so for 9 months, I saw a psychiatrist twice a week to be told that he had never met anybody as psychologically sane as I was, and that I should just live my life and be happy. His way of treatment, once he decided of the diagnosis, was for me to write anything that I could remember of the war years or the bad marriage years in a journal and bring it to him, and then on his next visit we would go over that, which we did. Each time he read it, he had tears in his eyes. 9 months, I wrote and wrote and wrote. I'm a very disciplined, organized person, so when he said to write anything, to me that meant you start from day one and you keep on going. You don't just take a piece here and there. So it's amazing for the people that have read my book to think that I could remember things back to 2.5 years, but again, for the lack of time, I won't give proof, but there was proof that I really did remember. It was burned into my memory. When I was done, a friend wanted to read it. She had been a private secretary, so she was a good typist. That was before computers, when anybody could type. And she typed up 368 pages of longhand writing. She typed up because she wanted to send it to her daughter in Tennessee to read, which she did. The daughter mailed it on to somebody else, to somebody else, to somebody else, and for years that thing just floated around. Half the time I didn't know where it was, and then I didn't care. And then one day, a lady from Seattle called, and she said, I just read your manuscript, and I would like to get your permission to have that published. And I said, what manuscript? I'm not a writer. And so she started reading some of that, and I said, oh, that's not a manuscript, that's just what I had to write. She says, well, it reads like a novel, and that needs to be published. And I just laughed. By that time, I had gotten sophisticated enough to know that you don't just write something and it automatically gets published. And I said, you can do whatever you want with that. Well, again, to make a long story short, 3 weeks later, I signed a contract, and 6 months after that, the book was born. I brought books for your convenience if you're interested in them. And life became quite good. At 78, I am happy, and I'm happy that I came to America. I'm happy I got to take that first step off that boat onto Ellis Island. Thank you.